And hi, everyone. So nice to have you over your lunchtime. Really appreciate you making the time for me to share with you a little bit about a personal story that I have that also anecdotally then led into a research study that I was doing. And all of this was centered around how do we lead the workforce of the future. So let's jump into it. A few years ago, I had a co-lead, and he was absolutely everything I thought that I needed to be as a leader. He was charismatic, he was super bold, and he was authoritative, directive, and absolutely visionary. Like he knew what needed to happen in the future. He was really confident in all the ways that I was absolutely not. Where I was quiet and observant, he was loud, daring, gregarious, and directive. Where I was really soft and unassuming and kind of hiding in the background, he was audacious. He was challenging. I mean, I spoke about like feelings and emotions and love. He spoke about big ideas and hairy goals. Where I was questioning my leadership stance and really wondering why I was put into a leadership position, he was incredibly self-assured and steadfast in his ability to lead. And during this time that we were paired together as co-leads, I spent many months feeling rather inadequate, to be honest, in comparison to him. I believed that I needed to be more like him to be an effective leader, because at that time he embodied what I thought great leadership was. And as a result, I kept comparing myself and feeling like I was less than because I wasn't bold, I wasn't charismatic, I wasn't authoritative, I wasn't directive. And in my mind, that's what leadership needed to be. That is, until I started to look closer at the team that we were leading. So, to my absolute surprise, genuinely, the team quite simply just did not follow him. I mean, to an outside observer, my co lead was incredibly good at saying the right things, managing up, painting a picture to executives of courageous and innovative leadership. However, when it came to our team, they pushed back against his directives. They, balked at his charisma. They chafed at his authority. They just quite simply chose not to follow him. And instead, weirdly enough, they would ask me for guidance and advice. They wanted to know my views on direction we should take and what my vision for our team was. And this was honestly incredibly confusing and baffling to me. Like I couldn't understand why this was happening. Like many of us at that time, I unknowingly shared the mental model of think manager, think male, which is actually a term coined in research, which surfaces an often unconscious gender bias we have when it comes to leadership. And according to that standard of stereotypical leadership, I personally found myself lacking. I by no means define myself as a great leader, guys. I was emotional. I was fluffy. I spoke about love and humanness at work. I honestly didn't really care about the work. I cared more about the people. Delivery was secondary to me. I also just didn't like being the loudest person in the room either. I really hate being the center of attention. So even this talk makes me uncomfortable. I just want to help people grow. And honestly, when I was in that role, I didn't know what I was doing half the time. So I was constantly asking the team what they thought, like what ideas did they have, rather than putting forward my own. And even though I was the most experienced person in our team, technically, as a natural introvert, I really much prefer just listening and letting others talk. I also really love getting to know the people on our team, and we'd spend hours sharing about our personal lives and what was happening over the weekend and what our goals were for the future and what we were thinking of doing. So I honestly, genuinely did not think I was effective as a leader at all. Yet, weirdly enough, to my utter confusion, the team followed me instead of him. What? What is happening? So, at the same time that all of this was going on, I was also on the hunt for a topic for my PhD. I just completed my master's. I was keen to find a gap in the research that I could contribute to. And I knew that I wanted to do something in the realm of leadership. It had always been a fascinating topic for me of what makes great leaders. And as an agile coach myself, I was curious as to the leadership we need for the future of work. So thinking more strategically about where the workforce is going and what kind of leadership do they need. Also, I was really curious about this weird phenomenon that was happening with our team and between myself and our co-lead and the team's dynamic, and trying to understand and get some research and data around what might be causing that. What I ended up stumbling upon in the research literally took my breath away. I came across a global study called the Athena Doctrine, where researchers surveyed thousands of millennials. So this research was based primarily on millennials, on what defined effective leadership to them. So what was their perception of good leadership? And what traits did they prefer in their leaders? So what kind of characteristics would they want in their leaders? They then surveyed a separate set of millennials, so a separate group, and they asked that separate group to categorize very stereotypically leadership traits according to masculinity or femininity. So just very stereotypical. How would you categorize these different traits? Are they more masculine in nature? Are they more feminine in nature? What they found when they overlaid these two data sets literally stopped me in my tracks, because it turns out that the most effective leadership traits preferred by millennials also happen to be considered feminine in nature. What? Looking closer, when I started digging into this as part of my research, I realized that these feminine traits felt a lot like my own leadership style. I literally had a holy shit moment. Like, maybe I wasn't that crappy of a leader that I thought I was. Maybe I was doing something right all along. Maybe my softness was exactly what was needed at that point. And the more I researched, the clearer it became that the younger generations entering our workforce need a different style of leadership in order to thrive at work, namely a more feminine style of leadership. And so my PhD journey began, and it's still ongoing. And what I'll be sharing with you today is my initial findings for my proposal. Um, and I started this PhD journey back in 2018. So this was, of course, pre-pandemic, and I'll touch on that when I get into some of the traits of the different generations. But what I want to share with you today is in the hope to help you future-proof your own leadership journey, and also enable you to understand what our future generations are looking for from their leaders of today. I'll spend a bit of time unpacking who these future generations are, and then what are those traits that they prefer in their leaders. So let's get into it. When I talk about the future of the workforce, I'm primarily referring to our millennials and our Gen Z. Millennials are already largely in the workforce. They're basically the majority now. And our Gen Z are about to enter or are already entering. They're at the beginning of their careers in the workforce. And whilst they definitely have some unique differences between the generations, when it comes to how they show up in the workplace and what they're expecting from their leaders, they're largely the same. So, millennials by next year, 2025, are on track to be 75% of the global workforce. Right? So, a large majority of our workforce are going to be millennials. Researchers often differ between the age ranges slightly, but on average, they're born between 1981 and 1996. So, if you're born between those age ranges, you're basically considered a millennial. And I'd love to see if we have any millennials in the talk today. Maybe just pop that in chat if you can relate to this. But how millennials show up in the workplace is that they tend to be really driven towards getting feedback. So they're the ones that are constantly asking, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right job? Can someone please tell me whether I'm on track or not? So they're constantly seeking communication and being engaged with. And millennials are also really team orientated. And because of the shaping forces of when this generation was born, there was a big emphasis in education around working in teams and doing everything in a collaborative way. And as a result, you have a generation that's now grown up with that kind of thinking of everything needs to be done in teams. Everything needs to be participatory, getting participation awards, like you get a star, you get a star, we all get a star just for showing up. That's the millennial generation. So everything needs to be collaborative, and therefore working in teams is their preference. They're also the first generation that really started to make noise about having a work-life balance. Now, again, bear in mind, when I started this research, it was pre-pandemic, and I definitely think that the COVID pandemic and working from home during 2020 to 2022 has shifted the whole workforce perspective around work-life balance and being able to work from home flexibly. But before that, the millennials were really the ones who started to make a lot of noise about, hey, we want more flexibility. We want to have a life outside of work. Our lives are not just simply about our careers and about working. Whereas previous generations, namely Gen Xers, baby boomers, even the silent generation, were quite into their work, and you had to prove yourself. You had to be extremely loyal to a company. You had to be working there for many, 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 many years. Work-life balance, what is that? Like, that's a joke. Whereas millennials have been the first ones to really start being loud advocates for that. Our millennials are also, I like to call them our special snowflakes generation, because they can come across as quite entitled. So millennials, when they started entering the workforce, had this view that, I've done my due diligence, I've gotten a degree, I'm entering the workforce and I'm expecting to be a manager within a year, right? So I had a very entitled mindset at work in terms of what they should be getting for what they're actually giving. But millennials are also the ones that have really started this trend where Gen Z has accelerated that, but started the trend of job hopping and really questioning loyalty to a company. For them, if their needs are not being met, they will simply go somewhere else. The concept of loyalty really started to be challenged by this generation and has definitely been taken forward by the Gen Z generation. But quite simply, if my needs are not being met, my career goals are not being met, the culture is not meeting my needs, simply leave and go somewhere else. Our millennials are also the generation that grew up with technology. So they are considered super tech savvy. They know their way around a phone. They know their way around new technology. And are also that cusp generation of when technology just started accelerating. So whilst they're a lot more comfortable with technology, they can still remember a time when you had to go to the library to use the Dewey Decimal System to be able to find books and research, right? We were there when the internet just about started. Which leads me to our next generation, our Gen Zers. So by 2025, so next year, Gen Z will be about 20% of the workforce. So just about starting to get into the workforce. And they're considered as those born between 1997 and 2012, right? So quite young. And our Gen Zers have literally grown up with the internet. They are extremely digitally savvy, born digital natives, as we call them. So for them, they cannot imagine a world without technology. And an article that I read a while ago described the relationship that Gen Z has with their phone or the internet as a limb. So if you were to say to a Gen Zer, take away their phone and they're not allowed to access their phone for the next week, to them it's as severe as having their arm chopped off, Like it sounds dramatic, but it is literally that kind of connection. They cannot imagine a world without it because they've been born into it. There's no frame of reference of not having that available. So born digital natives, and with that comes a lot of challenging of how we do things and how we need to be doing things smarter by using technology. So for Gen Z, they just expect technology as a baseline. Like things just need to work. Internet should just be available. There's no world where that's not available. Our Gen Z are also really pragmatic and realistic because they were raised by Gen X generation, who are often known as the rebellious generation, the ones that stick it to the man, but also in times of in times of war, in times of pandemic, in times of great recessions. That is when Gen Z was born into. So they've got a very realistic, pragmatic view of the world and are by nature quite frugal. Whereas our millennials are very idealistic because millennials were told you can be anything you want to be, just put your mind to it. So millennials then show up with that idealism and therefore the entitlement, whereas Gen Z grew up in a more pragmatic way and therefore more realistic in the workforce. They're also very independent and very individualistic, right? So they like to stand out, but they also like to do things on their own. So this is an interesting comparison between those two generations because you have millennials who love working in teams and you have Gen Z who actually prefer independent work. The difference, though, for Gen Z is that when you have a shared goal or an outcome that we need to achieve, then they want to come together as a team. But they don't want to stay as a team. They want to be able to break off and go and do their independent work. Whereas millennials love being in teams. So there's still a team element thread between these generations, but for Gen Z, they can do both. And they prefer to also do individual work as far as possible. Our Gen Z also really want a participatory culture. So they want their voices to be heard. They want their needs to be met. They want their leaders to take into account their perspectives, their views, their opinions on things. They want to be included in decision making, and they can be quite vocal about that. So if they feel like no one is paying attention to them or not taking their views on board, like millennial, they will simply leave. And this generation is a lot more severe in that stance than millennials. I think millennials can still stick it out a little bit, whereas Gen Z, absolutely not. We will just leave. And we can see that come through in I think it was about a year ago, where there was a lot of talk around the great resignation. Now, things have changed economically and in terms of the job market, where it's starting to get a lot tighter and a lot more difficult to find work. So it would be interesting to see how that plays out today. But very much that great resignation was driven by our Gen Z generation around, you know what, if it's just not meeting our standard, stuff it. We'd rather be unemployed. We'd rather not work than be in a toxic place or place where we don't feel valued. Interestingly, though, and this is a keynote for leaders to take on board, is that Gen Z do, however, want stability and security. So they are looking for a little bit more security. And that's that pragmatic, realistic part of Gen Z coming through. So if you can meet their needs, they're a lot more likely to stay because they want a little bit more security. But the minute that you don't, make no mistake, they'll step out. So really important to understand that. And hence, I think it's quite good to know how they would want to be led, right? Because they are going to be the majority of the workforce going forward. And as a result, our leadership stance needs to shift in order to meet the needs of this generation and be effective in terms of enabling them to thrive at work and therefore allow them to be able to contribute to their fullest potential. And this is where I've spent quite a bit of time in my PhD proposal, just trying to surface what are those different elements that our Gen Z and millennial generations want from their leaders. What do they deem as effective? And it just so happens that these traits, when you look at them all together, are largely considered to be more feminine traits in nature, right? So our millennials and Gen Z workforce are wanting their leaders to be emotionally intelligent. meaning that they want leaders who are able to manage their own emotions, but also be aware of others' emotions and how to lead through that, how to manage other people's emotions and influence that, how to hold space for emotions, how to cultivate emotional awareness in themselves and others. I really want people who lead with empathy, who can meet them where they are and understand how to take them on a journey for their own growth. So they want leaders who are self aware, who understand their own faults, who can take on feedback and be mindful of their own blind spots, and also know what they bring to the table. They want leaders who are confident in their strengths, know what they do well, but then also be able to understand where they're not that great and take feedback on board. Millennials and Gen Z want interpersonal connection with their leaders. Dare I say they want to be friends with their leaders? And I know that's a bit controversial, but it's really about that interpersonal connection, seeing me as a human. That's really important for millennials and Gen Z, is recognizing that I'm not just an employee who comes to work to do a job. I'm a whole human with traumas and a personal life and personal goals and things that drive me. And I'm not just all about work. And they want their leaders to understand them on that kind of level. And hence I say friends, but it's more around that understanding, which leads to the sensitivity to their needs. So millennials and Gen Z really want their leaders to understand their needs, be able to put themselves in their shoes, be able to lead them in a way that is effective for them, not just simply enforcing things on them. So again, there's that little bit of entitlement that tends to come through with these generations. But I think it's really important to understand that this is what they're needing from their leaders in order to be an effective leader of them, right? To help them thrive at work. They want leaders who take a personal interest in them as well, right? And understanding who they are outside of work. They want their leaders to coach them and mentor them. So both millennials and Gen Z have a huge drive for growth, for mentorship, for coaching. They want people to help them with their careers, be an advisor, and you can see that coming through in the other traits as well. Gen Z, very much so, but also millennials to an extent, really care about the environment. They care about the planet. They care about advocacy. You absolutely can see it in Gen Z with things like the Me Too movement, advocates for climate change. They want their leaders to also genuinely care about those things that they care about and not just talk about it, not just have a value statement that says, good for New Zealand, but actually demonstrating how we are doing that, right? And leaning into that. They want leaders who are collaborative and inclusive, right? Who take their opinions on board, who work together with the team, who include their voices and make sure that everyone does feel included. And that also leads to the participatory decision making. So they want to be considered when decisions are made. They want their voices and their opinions to be put on the table when decisions are made. They want leaders are flexible in their style, right? So being able to adjust according to different personalities, different needs, but then also considering flexibility from I can do work at 2 a.m. if that's my kind of schedule, as long as I'm getting the outputs, right? So shifting the thinking more to the outcomes versus the hours, and you have to be in a certain space from 9 to 5. It's being more open-minded around that and realizing that really it's the outcomes that matter. And if my rhythm is, I'm a night owl, so I do my best work 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. in the morning, being able to consider that and see how that might work. They also want their leaders to be inspiring and create meaning for them at work. They want to be motivated from something that's broader than just work. And again, that comes to the humanness side of things and recognizing them as humans. And especially our Gen Zs, for them, diversity is a norm. They've grown up in an incredibly diverse world, and for them, that's just a baseline. So talking about diversity inclusion is often a question mark for Gen Z. Like, but shouldn't that just be normal? Why do we have specific programs for that? It should just be the state of play. There's also something to be mindful of, is that they're deep advocates of diversity. So those are the different traits that both millennials and Gen Z collectively deem as effective and what they would want in their leaders going forward in order to enable them to thrive at work. And again, if you look at all those traits as a list, they lean towards more feminine in style if we're looking at it stereotypically. Now, it's usually at this point where people would then challenge the perspective of femininity and masculinity. And why are we even talking about that? Like, surely in the future, we shouldn't even be talking about female leaders versus male leaders. They should just be leaders. Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with that. And I think being able to give it a name, or at least label this collection of traits that we're looking at, enables us to engage with it. It enables us to classify and know what we're working with, so that we can actually define what that looks like and put plans in place to develop that if we want to, right? So it actually makes it more tangible by having a label that we can work with. Also, there tends to be a very negative connotation when we talk about femininity. Usually when we say someone is feminine, it's seen as a bad thing. It's seen as weak, especially when you combine feminine and leadership in the same sentence. We tend to be triggered and think, oh, a feminine leader means you're soft and you're weak. And it's about challenging that. Like, why is that the connotation? Many years ago, we would have never put the words female and leader together in the same sentence, because that was just simply not open to females, for example. So it's about challenging, I guess, the stereotype we have created around what good leadership looks like because of the past and because of how it's been built. But also categorically, this is not a gender war. This talk and this research is not about pitting female and males against each other and saying who's the better sex in terms of leadership. It's about understanding what are the characteristics that our future workforce is looking for in order to be effective. And it's characteristics. So you don't need to be a female in order to have feminine characteristics. You don't need to be male to have masculine characteristics. We're just simply talking about a stereotype around characteristics and not male versus female. Also, there is a paradigm, a research paradigm around think manager, think male, which is an unconscious bias we tend to have when we think about leaders. We tend to automatically think about masculine characteristics around leadership. And it's about just challenging that slightly and being a little bit more open-minded to whether there's another way to lead. So ultimately, for me, it's about adapting our leadership style to what might be needed for the future. Because at the end of the day, whether you're male or female, or regardless of how you identify, everyone can embrace feminine leadership characteristics. Also, to be considered a leader, it's about understanding who follows us, right? And we need to be able to adapt to who follows us, because can we really call ourselves leaders if no one's following? Then it's simply a title. So I think it's absolutely critical for us to steer into that kind of conversation in order to effectively help our future workforce to thrive. So that's my story. And that is just sharing with you some of the research that I found that I thought was really fascinating, and how that came through for me. And yeah, I'd love to open the floor and just hear what everyone, what your thoughts are about that, and what sits with you based on what I've just shared. So thank you.
We've got some comments for you and questions in the chat, Mispah, so I'll give you a chance to read those. It certainly sounds like, you know, these are very nurturing traits. They're things that are really deeply seated in care. And one of those aspects in leadership is that obviously takes time. Like, people need to allow time to be able to nurture and do some of these traits. It's a really interesting dynamic in how we go about leading. Okay. Over to you. There was a question. Maybe if we start with the first question that was in chat.
Yeah.
Around the research, and just a question around, does the research focus on just what's happened in New Zealand, or are there nuances for Southeast Asia, for example, or broader? So what's just your context for that?
Yes, so context of my research proposal was primarily in South Africa. So I'm from South Africa, and I started the research before I moved to New Zealand. But the study that I quoted, which was the Athena Doctrine, where they had looked at millennials broadly and their preferences for leadership traits, that was a global study. So that was thousands of millennials across the globe that they had gathered stories around, where they started to discover what millennials thought were really effective in that regard.
Nice. We've got a few comments on chat. I'll let you go through the chat directly. Is your screen okay for that?
Yes, right. So there's a question here around what impact do we think that the violence around Jacinda Ardern has impacted New Zealand women in the desire to aspire to lead as themselves? Oof, great question. Really, really great point, I guess, and comment around how women who watch that then think, how would that impact me if I were to step out and lead? And I can relate to that in the sense of the story I was sharing around my co-leadership, right? I really felt uncomfortable with being a leader, and whether my femininity was actually hampering me as a leader, and therefore I was not considered as a leader. So I didn't want to be a leader, and I didn't think I had what it took to be a leader. And it was really a point of vulnerability, but also being willing to challenge that kind of thinking that enabled me to be a lot more comfortable with showing up the way that I did as a female in leadership, but also then embracing the femininity. And I think what was really great for me with the research was it's just exactly what's needed at that point in time. It's not going to be for everyone, and that's also okay. But I think there's courage there to be able to step in and be like, you know what, I'm going to try things a little differently. And yeah, maybe that just might be the path to take. I'd love to know if there's any other thoughts on that perspective, because it felt more as a comment, and if the person is free to maybe just share a little bit about that, Rachel.
I might be sitting here with a picture of Monica behind me, but I have watched. I don't live in New Zealand. I haven't lived there for 26 years. But so my watching of what happened with Jacinda is highly through the media, and obviously the media that I choose to watch and listen to. So I was curious how that had really impacted New Zealand on the ground, as opposed to, I have an interest. That's, New Zealand's home. But I'm not in touch with what's happened in New Zealand as a result of that. So that's why I asked that question.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, I might move on to the next one. So we've got participation in decision making is one thing. How about subsequently accepting decisions which don't align with their personal opinion / contribution to the decision related to job hopping? Ooh, very good question. And what I found in the research was it's about being able to create an environment where people's voices are heard, not necessarily consensus where everyone has to agree with the decision, but more important to make sure that everyone has been able to voice an opinion or voice their perspective on that. And if it is a contentious decision, simply explaining why, right? So giving the thinking around this is where we're going with that kind of decision. So it's less about making sure that you're making decisions that I say you need to make as a generation, and more about being heard and having the opportunity to give their perspectives rather than just simply top down, this is what we're doing. I hope that clarifies that a little bit better. Next one thing that strikes me is quite a split between the workforce and the leaders, and people are either one or the other. How do we get more cross-pollination of all these characteristics amongst us all, so it's humans together? I mean, amen. Absolutely relate, Trish. And I think it's just about being willing to be human, right? And recognizing the humanness that we all have, and how do we bring that to the fore, and breaking down this construct around work versus life versus personal. How do we blend that a little bit more so that we're still able to produce results and add value and have meaningful careers, but we recognize at the end of the day, these aren't machines. We're humans with emotions, with goals, with traumas. And how does that come to the workforce? And as leaders, what kind of environments can we create to make that okay, to make that safer, to make it all right to be yourself? Which I think is also at the heart of this kind of ethos, is really caring about individuals and what they bring to the work, and how do we make environments that is more supportive around that. Yes, I'm currently being hassled in a workplace for being more feminine in style by a millennial female. So I hear what you're saying, that it's not a male-female split. Yeah. And what has been really interesting in some articles that I have read is that I spoke about this connotation around femininity and even female leadership. There's this queen bee syndrome that comes through, and basically it talks around how when women tend to step into more senior positions, they tend to act in ways that are more masculine in nature, because that's the standard of leadership. That's what you need to do in order to fit in. But as a result, then push other females out. And this is a research phenomenon, right? And it's interesting of just how conditioning in terms of what we deem as effective leadership is, because that's what you take on those kind of traits, right? And why this was so fascinating for me when I stumbled across it was, oh crap, okay, there are other ways to lead, and it's okay, and they're just as effective. Because it was something that I really struggled with, is how do I be more, I guess, masculine in my style? And it didn't feel authentic, and it wasn't me. So stepping into that was, yeah, really, really unnatural. But as a result, feeling like I couldn't lead because I wasn't that. Comment here by Andy. So I read a book called Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders? And the key premise is that many people confuse confidence with competence. Nice. People feel safer with confident leaders, even when they are less confident and more narcissistic. It's a hard one to overcome, and only via shining a light to what are the true competent behaviors will this shift. Thank you, Andy. Yes, I did also see that book. Well, I had read an article on it. I haven't read the book, but I read an article around why do so many incompetent men become leaders, and it is a confidence thing. It is your presence. It is how you show up. And again, it's that unconscious bias. We have that think manager, think male bias that we might not even be aware of, but because that's been the conditioning for so long of what leadership looks like, for the many years that we've been in corporate, that is just what we assume it needs to be. That's a good one. I think those are all the questions or comments.
I think there's a great underlying message there, isn't there, Mispah, around the power of confidence. And so recognizing, whether you're male or female, that some of those feminine traits that may once have not been valued in the workplace from a leadership perspective are going to be needed more of in the future. So back yourself with confidence and courage to embrace those and try them and seek feedback from people. And maybe that goes a little bit to some of the conversation you were saying too, Gretel, that despite what's in the media in terms of some of the pushback around that space, is to still have that courage of conviction. And with that courage can come confidence. And with confidence, people resonate that. They want their leaders to be confident. It gives them confidence in itself. So, you know, maybe that's a great thing as well. Yeah, good call, Andy. Confidence with humility, not hubris and arrogance or aggression. Yeah, nice.
Nice. All right. I guess if there's no other questions or comments or any other thoughts on this topic, we might call it there then.
We've got one more question for you there, Mispah.
What's next for me? In what regard?
So so you've completed this research, and have you completed your PhD now, or?
No.
Okay.
No.
So when the PhD is completed, how do you plan on sharing this further? I mean, thank you so much for coming and to share what you've brought today. But I guess my question is, how does it live longer?
Thank you, Gretel. Yeah, so I haven't finished my research, and I have paused it a little bit because the pandemic did throw a span in the works for me personally, but just also some of the things that need to be revisited. So what I'm sharing is the proposal I put together and most of my chapter 2 and 3, but I've put that on pause for now because from a work perspective, I've been stepping into more leadership positions, which has taken a lot of capacity. But it's a passion of mine, and I think leadership and leadership coaching and helping people see different ways of leading. And because I had experienced this so personally and been validated through that kind of research, it's very close to my heart. So I do plan on continuing to keep this conversation going in a broader sense, and I've been sharing it within my company, but with a few others as well who are a little more open-minded to hear this kind of thing, because I do recognize that this is quite confronting for some people, and can be a very uncomfortable topic to really delve into. So I have been sharing that, and I think in the future I'd love to share more of it. And go deeper into that kind of research, but not quite there just yet. I think for now I'm still trying to figure out my own kind of leadership and reflect on how I get better at that.
Thank you. Don't stop evolving.
Exactly.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Mispah, for your time today, and everyone for contributing to the conversation as well, because that brings an added value and deepness to it. So I appreciate your time, everyone. We have recorded, so if you know of somebody who would be interested in this, then please do share it as well. We'll be posting it on our YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Mispah.
Thank you, everyone.